What's one small thing someone did in your family that left a big scar?
When your own mother raises a glass at her birthday dinner and says, with this bright social smile that could slice a person open while still looking polite for photos, to everyone who is staying in my will. While her eyes slide right past you as if you are a guest who wandered in off the street, you learn very quickly what family means when money becomes the scoreboard and love turns into a coupon that only some people are allowed to redeem. And as the room chuckled in that nervous way people do when they hope a joke is not mean even though it obviously is, I felt my cheeks burn and my throat tighten, and I decided, right then and there, that if she wanted to turn me into the punchline again, I would let her finish the joke and then I would start telling the truth. I did not come to that dinner to fight, because you cannot out a person who believes she is the casting director of the family, but I did come prepared to stop playing the extra in a story she rewrites every holiday, every graduation, every crisis of mine that she shrugged off while writing checks for my brother's toys and my sister's whims, and I can say that without bitterness, because I have done the math in my head for years, counting the yes that flowed to them and the no that lived permanently in my phone as a text from my mother that said I should figure it out like adults do, which arrived the same week she wired a down payment for my brother's beach house and posted a boomerang of her clinking glasses by the water with a caption about blessings. So when she made her little toast tonight, I breathed slowly and told myself I had already survived worse than a room full of people pretending it was fine. The thing about being the child who is told to be independent is that you either break or you build, and I chose to build, not a perfect life because perfect is for Christmas cards and people who lie to themselves, but a spine and a plan and a folder where I kept every message, every promise, every time she used money to yank the leash and call it love, because while she thought I was being dramatic, I was being organized, and while she thought I was sitting quietly in my lane, I was mapping exits and collecting receipts, and that is not poetry, that is survival that looks boring until the moment someone tries you in public and you realize you are ready. So I let the laughter settle, I let her bask in the little power hit she always gets when she reminds the room who holds the pen and who lives on the line, and then I stood up, not to cry and not to storm out, but to speak like a grown woman who understands that shame is only useful when it belongs to the right person, and I tapped my glass once because if she could casually announce who mattered, then I could calmly announce that I did, too, and I said, in a voice that felt steadier than my legs, that I wanted to propose a different kind of toast, one that did not require anyone to audition for affection, and I thanked the people who showed up for me when bills did not wait and when quiet panic lived in my kitchen, and I named them out loud. Not with flowery words, but with clear ones, so the room could understand that while money talks, actions talk louder. There was a shift you could feel even if no one moved, because some relatives know exactly what has been happening and prefer not to choose sides as long as the wine keeps flowing, and some truly did not realize how bad it has been. So I gave them the kind of detail that cannot be shrugged off, reminding my mother, gently but firmly, that the last time I asked for help she texted that she could not enable me, and within the same week she posted a video tour of my brother's new place where she giggled about how family is everything, and I watched her blink while I spoke because she is not used to hearing the parts of the story that do not photograph well, yet I still kept it clean and measured because I was not there to sink to her level. I was there to raise mine. And since she loves the theater of a toast, I gave her one, the kind that splits a room without yelling, by turning to the guests and thanking them for celebrating a woman who has always been very proud of her planning. Then adding that I brought a gift that celebrates planning too, a little tradition I am starting where, instead of giving something expensive to the person with the most power, I give something that matters to someone with the least. So I held up a sealed note card addressed to the community shelter in Mom's town and announced that the donations I raised this week, in my mother's name and in honor of her birthday, because she always taught us to be generous, would cover a month of emergency groceries for women who are told to figure it out while other people toast by the ocean, and the applause that followed was not loud and messy, it was quiet and uncomfortable and real. And it landed exactly where I wanted it to, right in the gap between her public persona and the private arithmetic she does with her love. It was not the end game, and it was not the thing in my bag that would change the room later, but it was the first move that felt like breathing after holding my breath for years, and as my mother forced a smile that did not reach her eyes, I slid my fingers along the envelope I had not shown yet and said, still smiling, that I would love to share one more little surprise after cake because some traditions deserve a proper finish, and while she nodded and lifted her glass again, I watched her hand tremble just a little, knowing the party had started to turn and that, for once, she did not know which line I would cross next. People like to pretend that families are held together by love that is patient and unconditional, yet in my family, the glue has always been leverage that looks like love from a distance and feels like a ledger up close. And if you want to understand how a single toast can slice you open, you have to understand the small, steady cuts that came before it, the years when my mother, Elaine, made a habit of turning affection into a performance review and resources into a prize for people who made her look like a winner, which meant my brother, Grant, with his shiny purchases and loud victories, and my sister, Vanessa, with her talent for sounding grateful while collecting favors, and almost never me, the one who asked for plain help without applause and got told that adulthood means carrying your own weight, then saw checks fly out the same week to cover a beach house mortgage and a boutique lease, because those were investments in the family narrative that she could brag about at brunch. When I hit the kind of wall that sends your stomach to the floor, a medical bill that should have been manageable if life had not stacked problems 3 high and dared me to keep smiling anyway, I called Elaine and kept my voice even because I knew the script. The one where she lectures me about self-reliance, as if I had not already sold furniture and picked up extra shifts, and she said those familiar lines about not enabling me and about how struggle builds character, and I said thank you. Even though I wanted to ask why character was always demanded from me while comfort was handed out to my siblings like party favors, and within a few days she was posting photos from Grant's new place with a caption about family dreams. And you would think that would be the moment I cut ties for good, yet I did something quieter and more stubborn, which is that I started keeping everything, every text, every voicemail, every check that went to them, and every lecture that came to me, not as a petty archive, but as a map that showed who I was dealing with and what game she was really playing. I learned to stop arguing about fairness, because arguing ethics with someone who treats money like a crown only makes them tighten it, so I made a list of practical moves that did not require her permission. And I kept my head down and my job steady and my friendships alive, and I practiced the skill of letting a room think I had let something go while I was in fact building a case that did not need a courtroom to matter. And I collected the moments that strangers would not see in a photo, like the time Vanessa needed emergency help with payroll for her store, and my mother not only stepped in but called it a lesson in leadership, or the time Grant forgot to pay property tax and my mother laughed and said that boys learn by doing. While the exact same month I asked for a tiny short-term loan and got a paragraph about consequences and boundaries that might have been useful if it had not been so selectively applied. I told myself that if Elaine wanted to play Queen of the Will, I would become the clerk of reality, and I began requesting copies of documents that most people never ask for because they assume the family anchor acts in good faith. And I did it politely and by the book, writing to the bank to confirm beneficiary designations, asking the accountant for the last filing that mentioned the trust, and digging out the letterhead of the attorney who handled my father's estate because I remembered how he had looked at me at the funeral reception when my mother bragged about simplifying everything now that she was in charge, a look that said more than he could say out loud in a crowded room. And while my mother spent holidays narrating our lives like a hostess introducing a show, I spent evenings learning more about words like fiduciary duty and accounting request. Not because I wanted to sue my own mother, but because I wanted to stop being the easiest person to dismiss. There were times I felt petty for keeping receipts, and there were nights I hated myself for caring, yet every time I almost deleted the folder I would get a fresh reminder of why it mattered. Like when an aunt told me in a whisper that Elaine had joked at lunch about cutting me out if I kept being difficult, which in this family means telling the truth without the pretty filter, so I made peace with the idea that protecting myself was not betrayal. It was adulthood done without applause, and I began to test small boundaries that looked like nothing to anyone else, like replying to a group message with a simple clarification when my mother tried to rewrite a memory, and offering to digitize old files so the family would have everything in one place, which gave me the paper trail I needed without a single raised voice. And since she loved to make a show of rules, I chose a rule of my own, one that would not break the family, but would break the habit of pretending I had no options. And on a gray Wednesday in late spring, I walked into a notary's office with a neatly typed letter addressed to my mother and to the executor named in my father's trust. A letter that formally demanded a full accounting and copies of any amendments and transfers affecting the assets my father earmarked for me, and I mailed it. Certified to Elaine so there would be no pretending it got lost in a kitchen drawer, and I CC'd the attorney who had watched her boast about control like it was a virtue. Then I sat in my car and let myself breathe, because it was not loud, it was not cruel. And it was not even public, yet it was a move she could not erase with a toast or a caption. And as I stared at the little green receipt in my hand, I knew, with the calm that comes when you finally stop asking for permission, that the next time she decided to teach me a lesson, she would have to answer a few questions first, and that thought was enough to make me smile as I started the engine and wondered how long it would take her to open the envelope and realize that the long game no longer belonged to her alone. There is a difference between feeling invisible and watching someone make you invisible on purpose. And the week that followed the certified letter taught me that my mother did not simply forget me when it was convenient, but actively curated a story where my needs were character flaws. Because after she texted a curt line about how adults handle their own messes, she drove down to Grants Beach Place with a trunk full of gifts and filmed a slow pan of the backyard fire pit while giggling about family milestones, and I sat at my kitchen table with the receipt from the post office, a stack of past due notices spread like a hand I never wanted to play, and a memory of my father telling me, in the calm way he had when he wanted me to listen, that men like him buy peace by pretending control is love until it is time to choose, and that some choices make a person small forever. I had reached the kind of tired that does not show up on your face, but makes your bones feel borrowed, and in that tired place I picked a name out of the past that I had avoided, because I thought calling him would make this war official. The estate attorney who had handled my father's paperwork, a steady man named Richard Hartley who always asked if I wanted water before he talked business, and I told his assistant that I was my father's daughter, that I needed to see whatever he still had, and that I would sign whatever he required to authorize a release of copies, and when I sat across from him a few days later in that same no-nonsense office that smelled faintly like paper and varnish, he opened a file that looked untouched for years, and then he frowned. Not at me, but at the neat list of documents that did not match what my mother has been bragging about ever since she anointed herself keeper of the will. What he showed me was not dramatic or cinematic. It was the kind of quiet fact that moves mountains because it sits in ink and does not care about opinions. A letter of instruction my father had signed that laid out small but meaningful assets intended for me specifically, not out of pity but out of parity, including a transfer on death designation for a modest brokerage account and a small ownership interest in a storage property he co-invested in with a friend, both of which should have moved directly to me outside of probate, and a simple promissory note that documented a sizable personal loan to Grant that my father had expected to be repaid to the estate over time, which meant that any estate math my mother waved around at holidays was incomplete at best and manipulative at worst. And when Hartley looked up and asked whether I had ever received notice about any of this, I laughed the kind of laugh that sounds like you have run out of air. I asked him, in the most level tone I could manage, what a daughter is supposed to do when the person holding the family megaphone is using it to drown out the facts, and he said words that I will remember longer than any toast, that the law is not a gossip, that it does not argue about tone, that it simply requires people who hold power to account for how they use it, and then he drafted letters that were not angry and not dramatic, but absolutely direct, addressed to the bank, to the property manager of the storage partnership, and to my mother in her capacity as trustee of the family trust, reminding each recipient of their duties and requesting immediate confirmation of the assets and the status of transfers and the schedule of any distributions that had been made. And he sent them with the right copies to the right places so that no one could claim they had not been told. I drove home feeling like my ribs had loosened after years of being cinched tight, and while I wanted to call my mother and say that the universe had finally given me a fair referee, I kept my mouth shut. Because Hartley had explained that people who are very sure of their control make sloppy choices when they are forced to write things down, and that the smartest thing I could do now was act like nothing had changed. So I picked up dinner, answered 2 work emails, and waited. And waiting turned out not to take long, because the next afternoon my phone lit up with a series of messages from Grant describing a surprising glitch with a scheduled transfer from the trust and a question about whether I had started any drama, followed by a call from my mother that went to voicemail where she announced, in that careful, polite tone she uses when neighbors can hear, that there seemed to be an administrative delay and that she hoped I would not take it personally. I did not respond. Not because I wanted to be cruel, but because the best revenge is the kind that does not need an audience to work, and while the bank's legal department reviewed the requests and the trustee paused discretionary transfers to avoid liability, I spent my evenings assembling the folder that would become the spine of my backbone, with copies of beneficiary confirmations, date-stamped letters, and a clean, simple one-page summary that a room full of relatives could follow without a lawyer. And when Hartley called to say that he had received acknowledgement from the bank and the partnership and that the documentation would arrive in a few days, he asked if there was any upcoming family event where a little sunlight might encourage better behavior. And I told him there was a birthday dinner where my mother likes to hold court, and he chuckled softly and said I should bring an extra envelope and a calm smile, because we were about to give Elaine a present she could not return, and the moment he said it I realized that the breaking point I had dreaded for years had finally arrived on my terms, and that the next time she lifted a glass to her own power she would feel the ground shift under her chair. If the birthday dinner was going to be the stage where my mother measured people with a glass in her hand and a smirk on her face, then I wanted the night to feel less like a courtroom where she was judge and jury and more like a simple reading of facts that could sit quietly on a table and do the talking for me. So in the days after Hartley's letters went out and acknowledgments began to land, I built a file the way a careful person builds a bridge, not flashy and not fragile, with a clear cover page in plain language that even the cousin who hates paperwork could follow, a short list of what belonged to me, because my father had said so while he was alive, a summary of the property interest that the partnership confirmed in writing with my name on it, a clean confirmation from the bank that the transfer on death designation was not a rumor but a living instruction they were bound to honor, and a simple accounting line that showed my brother's loan as an obligation to the estate, rather then a gift that disappeared the moment he smiled for a photo, and I labeled everything calmly, because drama is loud but proof is quiet. I knew the first thing my mother would try was to yank the conversation back into the realm of tone and manners, where she always wins because she can cry on cue and accuse me of ruining a celebration. So I rehearsed my own manners the way a person rehearses a presentation that must land without any help, and I wrote 2 short statements on index cards I kept tucked in my purse. Not because I planned to read them word for word, but because I wanted safety rails I could touch with my fingertips if my voice shook. One card that thanked everyone for showing up for a woman we all knew to be strong and accomplished, and another that said, in the most neutral words I could find, that my father had left certain things to me directly, and that those things were accounted for now, which meant I could stop auditioning for approval and start behaving like an adult whose place in the family did not require applause or permission. Because Hartley cannot attend every family mess with a briefcase like a fixer in a movie, he did the second best thing and drafted a letter on his own letterhead that explained, in steady lawyerly words, that nothing I was presenting relied on my mother's discretion, and that the bank and the partnership had already recognized the relevant designations and interests, and that any remaining disputes would concern timing and bookkeeping rather than rights. So I printed 2 copies of that letter and slipped them behind the first divider in my binder, while another copy went into a sealed envelope addressed to my mother in her role as trustee, so that, if she tried to call the whole thing gossip, I could place the envelope in her hand and let the weight of her name on the label do the work. I also planned the part that would feel like a clean breath in a crowded room, the donation in her honor that I announced before anything else at the dinner, because I wanted the night to pivot away from fear and toward values that do not require heirs to perform for crumbs. So I called the director of the local shelter and asked for a simple certificate that confirmed a month of emergency groceries for families who were told to be strong without help, and I made sure the certificate used my mother's name, not as a trick but as a mirror, because if she wanted to be the kind of woman whose birthday posts talk about generosity, then I would hand her generosity with a bow on it and see whether she could hold it without flinching. Since I've lived my entire adult life expecting to be blindsided by a moving target, I thought it through to the tiny details that keep a person steady when someone tries to change the subject, and I packed extra copies for the relatives who would ask later. And I put a pen in my bag to jot down any new claims my mother made on the spot so they could be checked against the documents rather than debated over dessert. And I checked in with one aunt who still believes in fairness and asked her to sit near me, not to clap or to comfort, but to serve as a quiet witness if the conversation started to slide into invented history, and I set a boundary for myself that I would state the facts once, that I would not argue about feelings in front of an audience, and that if my mother demanded a scene I would hand her the envelope and stop speaking until everyone had read what they needed to read. The afternoon of the dinner arrived with that peculiar stillness that lives in your chest when you know you are done shrinking. And I placed the binder and the sealed envelope in a simple tote bag with the donation certificate tucked in the front pocket where I could reach it without fumbling, and I drove to the restaurant with a calm that felt unfamiliar but earned. And when I walked in and saw the table already arranged like a play she had directed for years, with Grant placed at her right, and Vanessa at her left and me down the side like a polite afterthought, I took the seat without commentary because I did not come to argue seating charts. I came to end auditions. And as the first round of drinks went down and my mother started warming up the room with one of her stories about how she raised independent children who do not need handouts, I ran my thumb along the edge of the envelope and told myself that when her glass finally rose and her line about the will floated over the centerpiece, I would let her script finish, and then I would place the letter on the table and watch, very calmly, as the play turned into something that did not require a narrator at all. The thing about a person who believes she is untouchable is that she does not expect paper to talk back. So when my mother lifted her glass and delivered her line about the will with that polished smile that has always told onlookers who is in and who is out, I let the laughter wobble across the table and then, without raising my voice or changing my face, I stood and thanked everyone for coming to celebrate a woman whose drive could power a small city, which earned me a few relieved chuckles. And then I said that birthdays should be for truth because truth is the only gift that does not expire, at which point I reached into my bag, took out the envelope that had sat under my palm for a week, and placed it on the table right in front of her hand so lightly that it would have been unremarkable if not for the way the room went quiet as soon as she saw her name spelled out as trustee. I said that I had brought a few clarifications to make future toasts easier on everyone's nerves, and I kept my tone friendly because nothing rattles a person who lives on control like a calm opponent, and I explained, as simply as I could, that my father, who loved all his children even when he found us maddening, had made some decisions while he was alive that were not subject to anyone's generosity after the fact. Decisions like assigning a transfer on death designation to a modest brokerage account that the bank had now confirmed in writing with my name on it, and allocating a small but real ownership interest in the storage partnership that had sent me a letter recognizing me as a partner of record, and, in a final bit of housekeeping that my mother has always treated like gossip, documenting a personal loan to my brother that the estate expected to be repaid over time, which meant that the stories about gifts and sacrifices would need a fresh edit before they got repeated at lunch. I did not wave the papers around, and I did not read every line, because the goal was not to stage a lecture, but to place a mirror on the table, so I slid copies to my aunt who still believes in fairness and to the cousin who keeps asking why I never say anything. And I said that none of this was about begging or shaming or earning a spot in anyone's future. It was about honoring what had already been written by a man who knew that control makes people cruel and that paperwork makes cruelty less effective. And when I saw Grant lean forward as if he had not realized his little secret had a receipt, I did not look at him because I was not there for his conscience. I was there for my own spine. which finally felt like it belonged to someone who would not apologize for asking that math be math even when the math was inconvenient. My mother tried to laugh it off and say something about misunderstandings that happen in families, but the way her voice snagged on the word trustee made her hand twitch and her glass slosh faintly. And before she could pivot to the old performance of wounded pride, I thanked the room again and said that to make sure there was no confusion. An attorney who had worked with my father had already circulated the relevant requests to the bank and the partnership and had reminded everyone of their obligations, which meant that any delays would be administrative rather than personal, and that I had no interest in dragging private matters into the light beyond what was necessary to stop the habit of public humiliation posing as humor. And then I rested my fingertips on the sealed envelope and told her that one copy was for her files, one for mine, and that any questions could be answered on paper rather than over dessert. There is a sound people make when the script finally fails, a breath that starts in the throat and lands in the shoulders, and I heard it from my mother as she sat down without meaning to, her chair catching the backs of her knees mid-cheer. And for a heartbeat the table did not know whether to clap or pretend this was part of the plan, until I gave them something safer to hold by lifting my own glass and saying that in honor of the woman who taught us to be resourceful, a month of emergency groceries had been funded in her name for families who are told to carry everything alone, which got the kind of soft applause people offer when they want to move forward, but understand something important just happened behind them. I could have ended there, yet I wanted one more turn of the screw, not cruel and not theatrical, just definitive, so I added that since I would no longer be auditioning for access or approval, I had already signed the forms to retitle the brokerage account and had notified the partnership that distributions intended for me should be sent to my address directly, and that I would not be discussing discretionary trust transfers at parties because those are conversations for ledgers and signatures, rather than centerpieces and jokes. And then I thanked my sister for handling her store with enough competence to know that clear invoices solve most drama, which made Vanessa tuck her hair behind her ear and stare at her plate. And I told my brother that I was sure the estate would be open to a reasonable schedule for repayment that did not choke him, but also did not pretend he had not signed anything, and I did it without heat because my win did not require their loss. It required their acknowledgement. What I did next felt almost boring, which is why it mattered, because I closed the binder, slid the envelope closer to my mother so she could feel the weight of it with her own fingers, and sat down like a person who had finished a task at work. And I let conversation return in little waves that sounded off-key for a while until the room found a safe topic, and when the cake arrived and someone tried to make a joke about candles and wishes, my mother did not look at me, which was new, and she did not tell a story about my childhood independence, which was newer. And by the time the server box leftovers, my phone had already pinged with an email from the bank confirming receipt of final signatures that had been waiting on a trustee's acknowledgement that she could no longer delay without risking the kind of attention she hates. More than anything, the kind that comes with dates and letterhead. On the way out, my mother put a hand on my arm that felt more like an old habit than a gesture, and she said that we could talk privately after the weekend, and I told her, as gently as I could, that I would be happy to respond to anything in writing and that I hoped her birthday was still a good one, and then I hugged the aunt who had watched me climb out of a story that never fit. And I walked to my car with a calm that did not feel like triumph so much as relief, the kind that tells you the worst is over because the rules are finally written down, and while I know there will be fallout and whispered calls and attempts to rewrite what everyone just saw, I also know that the next time my mother raises a glass and makes a toast about who matters, she will feel the edge of the envelope before she speaks, and that is enough for me, because I did not come to win applause, I came to end auditions, and I did, and the beauty of paper is that it keeps saying yes long after the party is over.